It bears repeating. It bears repeating this story of the life of Martin Luther King, Jr., which we reflect on this weekend each year. It bears repeating his message, which we have yet to see realized in our nation, and which this year in particular, it feels as if we have yet to see realized in our nation. It bears repeating and figuring out each year what is our individual and collective part of the story. It bears repeating a particular story that was in the UU World a few years ago about when our own Rosemary Bray McNatt, one of our ministers, now the president of the Starr King School for the Ministry, then a journalist, interviewed Coretta Scott King, the great man's widow, who told her that she and Martin had seriously considered being Unitarian Universalist at one time. King's widow said this: "We gave a lot of thought to being Unitarian at one time, but Martin and I made the decision that we could never build a mass movement of Black people if we were Unitarian." It bears repeating, because when I first read this story in the World, I heard the part about the mass movement of Black people, and I assumed that the Kings chose not to identify with us because we certainly lacked the demographics then and now to be or do that well. But it bears repeating, because when I read it again and hear it again today, what I hear is something else, perhaps. That perhaps they did not think that we were people who had the faith resources to look at the enormity of the inequities, the enormity of the struggles before us, and not turn away or get lost in despair. And was he right? Were they right? I put that question to us today as the one to contemplate in this particular year, in 2016, when these issues are all before us again. The Reverend Otis Moss III, a United Church of Christ minister in the African American tradition, believes that the days when the religious community has to lead in these struggles are not yet over, even in a world that is increasingly secular. He says to be able to be truly an ally in the Black American experience, you have to be able to hold the pain and yet not give into despair. Can we do that? Can we wrestle with the truth without looking to blame the victim or assume some culpability which allows us to dismiss the statistics like the ones we read before? I want to repeat that those statistics are not from some wild radical group. They're from Time magazine from this summer. They had a few more. I want to put them out there for us. It's about this inner nation that we have nestling in this larger, more prosperous one. Here's a few more. If white America were a country, its high school graduation rates would rank with the likes of the UK and Finland, but Black America would be on par with Chile and Poland. Black household wealth is just over the median wealth of an adult living in the Palestinian territories. If Black America were really its own country, it would be ranked 44th globally on that figure, behind Portugal and post-communist Lithuania. Black Americans' rates put them with the likes of Mexico and Thailand for health indicators, whereas white Americans are much closer to those of Switzerland and Japan. The life expectancy of 75 years for Black Americans puts them beneath Tunisia, Panama, Costa Rica, and Cuba. If Black America were its own country, it would rank number 3 on the world list of absolute prison incarceration, ahead of Russia, Brazil, India, and Thailand. These are hard truths. Can we see them and not turn away to avoid despair? Reverend Moss says we need to remember that many in the Black community live in what he knows to be a state of post-traumatic stress. He says we should more aptly title the Black American experience post-racial stress syndrome, and that it is real. Science is now finding that trauma is transmitted across generations, not only through the behaviors which one damaged generation might inflict on another, but literally carried in the body, perhaps even a part, it seems, of genetic memory. Something which can be triggered if there are negative experiences, which the persistence of systematic racism provides, unfortunately, for Black people today, for Native Americans and others marginalized in our society. Martin Luther King Day invites us this year, I think particularly, into a compassionate contemplation on the African American experience in this nation, not as problem solvers, but as witnesses, people of compassion. Compassion, a word which means nothing more than to feel with. We need to feel with, to witness, to acknowledge, and to be present, even though it makes us uncomfortable. Is anyone out there uncomfortable? I am very uncomfortable knowing this situation. We need to be able to, as Reverend Moss says, look into that pain, see that it exists, and not look away, which is not easy. Now, last week, we had a guest after service, a young woman named Molly, who was raised Unitarian Universalist, who has become part of the local leadership of the Black Lives Matter movement. And I need to say that many of the leaders in that movement are, in fact, people who were raised Unitarian Universalist. Here's the thing. Most of them are no longer active in our congregations. Now, I had the chance to meet Molly because I was at the Thanksgiving demonstration against Walmart, where Bob Lane introduced me to her, and she spoke about her UU roots. And it was clear to me that she no longer found them relevant for the work she was doing every week on racial equality. Black Lives Matter is a movement begun by 3 young Black, queer, female-identified leaders who want people to pay particular attention to what is happening in the lives of their people and their communities, because, yes, while of course all lives matter, the lived experience of Black people in this nation is that theirs does not. It bears repeating. That conversation between Coretta Scott King and Rosemary Bray McNatt, to take it deep into our hearts and let our hearts break open a little bit to contemplate that. Because Martin King's theology was really mostly compatible with ours in his day. And yet, what he knew was that he was going to need somewhere along the way something very solid, something very strong to hang on to before his struggles were over, and we know he did. And though we celebrate the times when he was courageous, his friends and disciples will tell us that many times he was afraid, just afraid. One of those times he said, "I am here today taking a stand for what I believe is right, but now I am afraid. The people are looking to me for leadership, and if I stand with them without strength and courage, they too will falter. I am at the end of my powers. I have nothing left. I've come to the place where I cannot face it alone." This is the uncomfortable truth that I have come to believe over the years since I first read Rosemary Bray McNatt's article. I have come to believe that King believed that he could not build a mass movement of Black people from the platform of Unitarian Universalism because he was not sure that we had the depth of commitment, conviction, and faith to make it through the hardest parts of the journey. He wasn't sure that our open-ended belief system didn't mean no belief system at all, and he wasn't sure we couldn't stop focusing on what we didn't believe and start shaping our lives around what we did. I need to tell you that I've done any number of Martin Luther King Day sermons before. And for those of you that were in the class I taught and who had dinner with me as one of our Serve You events last night, you could tell I was a little distracted, and here is why. I have never done one where it feels as if it is such an important time to decide who we are. The race divide is widening again in this nation, and it's likely to get harder before it gets easier. We can decide in these moments whether to be witness or critic, to discern what our core beliefs are, which some of us will be doing in a conversation beginning today at 2:30 in the Oak Room. But what is important is that we decide who we are, whether we have the resources to truly look at what is happening, and how we get them if we do not. I try to reread King's Letter from a Birmingham jail every year. It's one of my personal spiritual disciplines. And this year, what I found was what is written there is frighteningly relevant. When King writes about the conditions and his level of frustration and what could happen out of that frustration, the conditions he names seem haunting and prophetic, not historical at all. Here's one of the things he wrote. I must confess that over the last few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's greatest stumbling block in the stride towards freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I can't agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically feels that he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by the myth of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait until a more convenient season. Shallow understanding, King says, from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. We will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the vitriolic words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people. We must come to see that human progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. Now, Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hahn is probably now best known among us as one who helped bring Buddhism in a very understandable form into the West. But he lived in Europe because he was thrown out of his native Vietnam for being a radical peace activist. Martin Luther King so admired Thai, as he's known by his friends, that he once nominated him for a Nobel Peace Prize. Thich Nhat Hahn has been described as a cloud, a bulldozer, and a butterfly. Those are very different ways of living an engaged life of value in the world. I believe that that means that he has the spiritual heights to contemplate the largest frame, the intractability to be in the streets, arrested and beaten, and the power to move from place to place to keep his dream of peace alive. Just as King and his dear friend Ralph Abernathy were not the same leader, Abernathy was not a bulldozer, for example, they both had a critical role to play. And in fact, it was Abernathy who inspired King to give his last speech about what he saw from the mountaintop. It bears repeating. What would have happened if King had been a Unitarian Universalist? What would happen today if one of the next prophets around racial equality arises from our midst? Will we see them? Will we know them? When they ask for a witness, will we give it? Tomorrow we will be bearing witness here in Walnut Creek, a city which has risen in affluence and which has in its DNA the ethos of a white flight community, which is in fact an embodied look away from despair. And this afternoon, as I mentioned, some of us will begin a discussion about how we give voice to our core and sustaining beliefs. These are small things. You can choose another. These are some that we're doing together. It bears repeating that poverty is a killer, that hate and discrimination of any nature saps the lifeblood out of people. It bears repeating that those of us who have economic power and facial privilege must use it in service of a more equitable world. It bears repeating that it is in fact time to step out of our comfort zones and look at the disquieting, soul-abrading truth of what is happening to members of our human family, and to meet it not with despair or a look away, but with witness and commitment. It bears repeating that story about the Kings and Unitarian Universalism. It bears repeating every year that I'm alive, until I feel as if his conclusion could be different. When we will have the strength, which I know we do already, to meet that challenge and to open ourselves to a burgeoning of compassion and faith. I know we can, if we look inside our hearts and see our own strength, if we are willing to witness in the service of these hard truths and in the service of a world in need of an unblinking glance. May we be the ones to make it so.